think we're all set to begin. I'm Tina DeBellegarde, and I'm very happy today to have Libby Cudmore with us. She is going to speak to us today about her expertise in short fiction writing. Let me give you a little bit of background on her short fiction. Libby Cudmore's debut novel, The Big Rewind, published in 2018 by William Morrow, received a Kirkus-starred review and praise from Publishers Weekly, Romantic Times, and Booklist. She's the author of the Martin Wade PI series at Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. Her short fiction has been published in Tough, the RS 500, Memoir Mixtape, The Big Click, the Stone Slide Corrective, Pank, the Barrel House Blog, the anthologies Hanzai Japan, Welcome Home, Mixed Up, and A Beast Without a Name is forthcoming from the Normal School. She is the associate editor of Rock and a Hard Place and the co-editor of the anthology Lawyers, Guns, and Money with Art Taylor, which was released this past Monday. Like I said earlier, I'm really excited about this event because I love writing my short stories and I kind of stayed away from it. So you're going to give me lots of new energy, I'm sure. So I'm going to pass it to Libby. I'm going to put Libby on, I don't know if I put her on speaker view, if that affects anybody else. So if you choose to, you can put her on speaker view. And Libby, go ahead.
All right, so thank you so much for having me today. And I want to say before I get started that everything I say is from my experience with short stories. One of the wonderful things about short stories is that nothing anyone tells you is the only way to do it. There are so many incredible ways to write short stories that I couldn't possibly cover them all, and people are constantly coming up with new ways. I've seen short stories written in crossword puzzle formats. So this is merely a starting point, and I really hope that this energizes your creativity and you come up with some really spectacular ways to tell your own short stories. So as we get started, when we talk about short stories, there's a couple ways to talk about them. For starters, you've got microfiction, which is really anything under 500 words. That's super, super, super tight. That's even a little crazy for me. You've got flash fiction, which is 500 to 1,000 words. You've got your short story, which is generally 1,000 to 7,500. Some people stretch that up to 8,000. You've got your novelette, which is 7,500 to 20,000, and your novella, which is 20,000 to 40,000. Anything beyond that is a novel. Now, each of these has, hello? Oh, is somebody not on mute?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to please put yourselves on mute if you can.
Yeah, sorry. And also, I'm going to ask to just hold questions right to the end, and I'll make time for a Q&A and hopefully a little time to write. If not, I'll give you a writing exercise to head out with. But with each of these comes, different rewards, different challenges. For example, micro and flash fiction allow for a lot of alternative prose styles and language choices that might get really tedious in a longer work. But today specifically, we're going to hover around the short story territory. So these are aiming for places like Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, Alfred Hitchcock, Tough, Rock and a Hard Place, we're always looking, and some others. So I want to talk briefly about the mystery. For those of you who are joining us from outside the genre. You've got your sleuth, and whether that's an amateur or professional or law enforcement officer, and you've got a transgression that they are tasked either by choice. They decide, yeah, I think I'm going to solve this, or by circumstance, professional obligation, and they're tasked with solving that. Now, lately, I've been really tending to write in the traditional detective mystery, but if any of you at Ellery Queen and you have the March-April 2022 issue, there's a great story in there called Rise by Ashley, Ruth, and Bernier. And that's a story of a woman unraveling the mystery of what happened to one of her grandmother's recipes. She's not a detective. It's not your traditional detective story, but it is a mystery, and it's absolutely phenomenal. So if you haven't read that, really cannot recommend it enough. Now, a lot of what we're going to talk about today can also apply to the crime story, which of course follows the criminal as they commit their dastardly deed. Also in the March and April 2022 issue of Ellery Queens is Wendy Hornsby's Cardigans, which I'm a huge fan of Wendy's. I absolutely love her work. And Cardigans is riveting and charming. But it's a crime story about a woman and her lust for cardigans and where it takes her. Which brings us to inspiration, because those are two very different types of mysteries from what we tend to think of as a mystery. There's somebody murdered and somebody has to solve it. So where do you get inspiration for short mysteries and crime stories? Well, my first suggestion is to look around. Read crime stories in the newspapers, and not the big ones, which we are all aware of many that are happening all around us all the time. But look at the weird little ones. Look at liquor store holdups and illegal alligator farms and arson. And think about the kind of person who might commit this crime and why. And think about the kind of person who would solve it. You can also look on things like next door. You know, oh, there's somebody creeping around the neighborhood stealing people's recyclables. Well, why would they be doing that? Why is someone really concerned about the house that leaves their Halloween decorations up year round? So look around and see the weird little, not necessarily crimes, transgressions, and ask yourself, what kind of story can I draw from that? Who lives in the house with the Halloween decorations up all year round? But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Now, one of the great inspirations that I find in my work for short fiction is I look to songs. And obviously, we just published the Warren Zevon anthology, Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and all of those are based on Warren Zevon songs. I've been in anthologies based on Steely Dan songs, Talking Heads songs. The RS 500 was all short fiction inspired by music. So look into your favorite song and see if there's an image that grabs you, and you can tease that out. And what's great about a song is that it's already a short piece of fiction. There's a few things there, and I'm not saying necessarily write the song as it appears, but draw out an image and go crazy with that. Not too crazy though, because you don't want to have a novel on your hands. This is about short fiction. I also really like the Am I the A-hole Reddit for just, again, weird transgressions. The story I have in what is it, Bleeding Terror, was based on one of those. Or look to your dreams. And dreams might be great for really microfiction because they're already so weird that you could take just a little piece from that and tease it out into something kind of cool. And so one of the other things, everybody still with me? We're all good. We have so little time. I want to make sure we get to everything. But one of the things that I want you to keep in mind about short fiction is that it is, as the kids say, a vibe. It's a lot of it is a mood, because you only have your reader for a few minutes, for maybe 4,000 words, 6,000 words. You don't have a lot of time for these elaborate descriptions of a building or a forest or what the character is wearing. You don't have time for a ginormous cast of characters. So the mood is everything. And that mood can be light or dark. It can be brooding or silly. And that's your call. I tend to go with sort of a dry melancholy myself. And that I think is inherent in the detective genre, and I sort of lay into that. But your mood is something that will remain constant through your setting, through your dialogue, even through the crime itself. And that's really important when you're thinking about your crime, is that there's never going to be a light, fun story where a sexual assault occurs. It's weird because you can have a light, fun story where a murder occurs, but not a sexual assault. So that's something to think about. When you think about the crime you are choosing, think about its implications on the mood, on characters we may never see, but how it reverberates throughout this community that you are creating. As I said, short fiction has a neighborhood in it that we just might never see because of the constraints of the genre. But we want to make sure that we are taking care of those people and letting them have a life, even if we don't see it, if that makes sense. So that's something to think about. And now you're also going to want to decide what tense your story is written in. And this is a big one. That's again, past, present, or future tense. And your perspective, whether it's first, second, third, omniscient. And this is where you can play around for really short work. I really like second person in micro and flash fiction, you. I think there's an intimacy to it that would get a little heavy in a novel length work, or even traditional short story. In short work, I like working in first because third feels like there's too much legwork, and that's a personal preference. Do not let me decide how you're going to write your story. I do not need that kind of pressure. First and second really allows the characters to control the mood, what's going on in their head. And third puts it a little more in the hand of the narrator. So we've got our crime, we've got a character, and we've got a mood. Now we want to get started actually on the short story. Now, I like to open on an image myself. My first Martin Wade story, which appeared in the September 2020 issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, that opened with him observing court proceedings. So you get the image of the courtroom and a little internal reflection on his own brushes with the law. Now, this image could be the client. This image could be the MacGuffin, the item that everyone's going to want. Or it could be the protagonist painting a picture for us with their internal monologue. But it's a great way to establish who the protagonist is, what the mood is going to be, establish the setting a little bit, and really just drop us in. Now, one of the questions that I always get when I teach classes about mystery and crime fiction is, when do you introduce the crime? In a short story, personally, I want to see the mystery introduced within the first 2 pages. If you could get it on the first page, that's even more ideal, as this is a short story and there is no time for any shenanigans. If there's a client, get them in there. If your character is going to commit a crime, let's start laying the groundwork for that crime. That crime may not occur until the absolute last paragraph. But when we look at that last paragraph, we need to be able to go back and see where those steps started to be laid out. And that goes into your motive. What does your criminal want? Why are they going to commit this crime? What has happened? And you also, going back to the mystery, lay out, why is your sleuth going to solve this crime? If any of us came across a crime in progress, we would like to think that we would help out. If we found a dead body while walking through Central Park or jogging, according to Law and Order, jogging is the #1 way to find a dead body in New York. But chances are we would call the police and let them take care of it. But if you have, again, this amateur sleuth, they're wondering about this stray dog they keep seeing, and they set about to figuring out whose stray dog it is. Why? Is it simply because they care about dogs? This is where we need to get that right off the top, and we need to work it through. We need to find out their motivation. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the crime you start with does not have to be the crime you end with. In fact, the best stories don't stick with the same crime. What starts with a simple tale or some missing jewelry could turn out to be something far, far more dastardly. That's where things get really fun. So how do you start this story? You've got a nebulous idea. You're like, oh, I read something really interesting in the paper, or I had this dream, and I want to turn it into a short story. So gather your protagonists, put them in the room with you, picture them, and set them off on a day where something is just different. Something's off for your protagonist. Something just doesn't feel right, or seem right, or looked right, or act right. There's that stray dog. And you keep seeing it. It doesn't have a collar. No one on next door has said anything about it. But why is this dog wandering around your neighborhood? Now, and there you go. There's your moment that is just unusual. Now, in a crime story, similarly, you could start with something going really wrong, and this character just lashes out. There's maybe they went to pay a bill and there's no money in their account, and that's weird that their spouse didn't come home, and their phone is showing that they're in Las Vegas. What's that about? So your short story needs to be something just different about today and why. Now here's the hard part and the fun part, because you're going to need a great first line too. Again, no time for shenanigans. You have to grab your reader off the top, drop them right in as this day unfolds, and we're off to the races. If I could tell you how to write a great line, I would. If I could tell myself how to write a great line, I would. It really is trial and error. But you have to write that first line. And that is the hardest part. And I know that. I struggle with first lines myself, especially when you are staring at that big, empty, blank page. But the only way out is through. And so you just need to write a line. You can always go back and fix it up and make it pretty, but make it short, sharp, and sweet, or nasty. Your call. Now, the other question I get the most when I teach is, in a mystery, how many clues do you need? And I have thought about this ever since somebody asked it in my last class. And I've come up with my formula. I want to see, when I read your mystery, 1 clue per scene. This keeps tension moving forward. Now, remember, a clue is not a cigarette butt. It's not just a footprint or a blood spatter. A clue is, it's information. It's a character that has something to tell you. It's that revelation that your detective has that something isn't adding up. So clues, I'm saying very broadly, but you need to have 1 per scene. Keep things moving, keep things moving. And of course, I don't have to tell you guys about a red herring. This is Sisters in Crime, after all. You guys know all about the red herring. For those of you who are joining us from outside, the red herring is a clue meant to distract the reader and your sleuth. It goes nowhere and they got to start all over. I also feel like I don't see enough detectives getting hit in an alley anymore. That's, again, a personal preference. I just wrote a scene where my detective, Martin Wade, takes quite a beating in a hotel parking lot. So I'd like to see more of that. And that can be a physical beating. It can be an emotional beating. But I'd like to bring that back. There was always a scene in classic detective fiction and film where they got pulled into the alley and got the tar kicked out of them. So, but you need to make them struggle and you need to make them bleed. But I mean, no one said solving crimes was easy. If it was easy, all of us would do it. Now, with a crime story, you also want to keep adding obstacles and tension in your criminal's way. Maybe that is the security guard at the bank they were going to rob took a vacation and now there's a new security guard and you don't know what their movements are. They do things differently. Or somebody gets cold feet before the diamond heist. Or it seems like, did that cop just drive by? I feel like I've seen that car before. Even though sometimes in crime fiction, your criminal gets away clean, they don't get away entirely clean. Because if they go in, they rob a bank and that's it, and they have money and they fly to Bermuda, that's not really that exciting of a story. It's also just not realistic. But we want them to have to face some obstacles and some tension and some anxiety. So now I have to throw this in for everybody. Remember, we're getting all these ideas, we're spinning, we have all these great scenarios, these great characters we're building, but you've only got around 6,000 words. Now, some magazines put their limits at 2,000 words, 4,000 words. So the big trick is to not go too long. Don't get too wrapped up in it. And as you're looking at your lines, as you're looking at this draft that you've written, remember, when in doubt, take it out. But how? You're probably asking. So that's why I'm here, to tell you. You want to start as close to the ending as possible, which is classic short story advice. But it also holds really true. What is the end game for your protagonist? In a mystery, they've got to solve the mystery. So we just back it up a little bit. You don't have time for tomfoolery. Get them right to work, getting where they need to be by that last period. If they have to go to a doctor's appointment and it doesn't have anything to do with the mystery, with the story itself, don't show them at the doctor's appointment. Skip it. if it doesn't add anything. You want to keep your descriptions really sharp and really tight. Does it matter what every building in the city looks like? No. What we are looking for is the unusual. If it's different, give it a little description, 1 or 2 sentences, because we don't want our characters to exist in a black box. And setting is always one of those that I find writers either put too much in or not enough in early drafts. I am a black box writer, and I think that comes out of a theater background. And I think that comes from early rehearsals where there's no props, there's no set. It's just you reading your lines to someone else who is reading their lines. So my early drafts tend to lack action and they tend to lack setting. And then I send it to my agent and he says, you don't have any setting, slow down. You need to pad this out a little more. And then I add in setting. But your characters, they can't exist in the black box, but they also can't exist in a forest where every tree is described. Again, we only have 6,000 words. If your character wouldn't take notice of the color of her car, there's no need to describe it. Again, she comes out and her black car has red graffiti all over it. She's probably going to notice that. It's probably something she's going to take into account. Now, this also goes for characters. It is not a parade. It is not a high school reunion. There is no need for an enormous cast. Now, in my detective fiction, I generally have my detective, Martin. You have your client. I usually have a main resource that he can lean on. In the story that I have in the May-June issue of Ellery Queen, he has an informant who works for the DMV named Denise. And because I'm working with a series character, I can reference Denise later on. So she gets a little description here, but I'll just reference her in later stories. He's had a DA that he works with, and he has a cop who he has sort of a semi-rival relationship with. Because again, nobody exists in a black box. But you're going to want your criminal and then maybe 1 or 2 others to give clues or trip up your character just for variety. Now, it's tempting to go overboard when we think about how many people we interact with in a day. I could write a short story about giving this workshop and all of your beautiful faces, and it would probably end up being a novel because there are a lot of you and you are all delightful. So if I was writing a short story, I may have to pick 1 or 2. Whoever asks the best question is going to end up in my next story. So think about that. I'm just kidding. Again, the key here is unusual. If they don't have something unusual to add, something that moves that story to that next scene, if they're not giving that clue or obstructing our criminal or tripping up our detective, get rid of them, combine them into someone else. The kid who runs the gas station where your character fills up their car does not need a full scene and a full description. Unless it's not the usual kid that works at the gas station. Something's off. And one other thing to keep in mind is that some stories might not be short stories. I believe that with the right tone and the right voice, you can make a novel or you can make a short story out of anything. But there are some stories that may just be too big, that may require too big a cast of characters. And you can try for writing the novelette. The truth is most places don't publish them. You could self-publish them. Ellery Queen occasionally publishes one. Obviously, they've got the Joyce Carol Oates story in the March-April issue. But if it gets too big, well, that's what the novel's for. So you can save that. And actually, I'm working on a short story right now that I'm really struggling with. It's a fantasy story, which isn't my normal genre. And I'm thinking there might be a novel in here. There might be too many voices and too many stories to tell in 4,000 words. So sometimes you have to just release it. And sometimes you may be writing a novel and you may find that most of what you're doing is description, is these sort of go nowhere scenes. Maybe that novel is a short story. So don't feel restricted to the genre. Don't feel like I have to write this as a short story or I have to write this as a novel. Give yourself permission to play in that space. So now we're up to the end. We've got characters, we've got our clues, we're moving through the setting. We're keeping it tight, we're keeping it lean. I wish I could tell you how many clues you have to have total. Like a short story should have 6 clues. 1 per scene. That's the only formula I can give you. But in a mystery, traditional capital M mystery, you're gonna have to have your sleuth solve the mystery. That's just how it has to go. And whether that ends satisfactorily or how it affects the detective or the client, there's room to play there, but we need to figure out who did it and possibly why. Now, in a crime story, which I'm starting to dip my toes back into, it's up to you whether they get away with the crime or not on the page. And again, I think of when Wendy Hornsby's A Bit of Bling. Another great story from her. And same with Cardigans. Do they get away with it? I'm not going to tell you. Go read the story yourself. I don't give away endings. But for the time, it seems that this is the ending you have. Who knows what happens after the last period? That's up to the reader to imagine. But with crime stories, there's a great line from Burn Notice that I like to think about, which is whether this ends in a handshake or a bullet, well, that's up to you. So write that, pin that on your wall. And that's how your crime stories can end. They can either end well for the criminal or they can end poorly. And an ending, like a beginning, isn't always easy to stick. Again, I like to try to end on an image. Something that will stay with the reader, something that will haunt them. And that's advice I got from my friend Lexa Hillier, who's a poet. She said, an image lasts longer than a thought. And I like the idea of the image, of being able to picture it rather than the character telling you something. And you've got to stick that landing with a good, solid last line. Best advice I ever heard, and I've heard it from multiple people, so I can't give it to one. Simply end the story. Don't draw it out. As you write your ending, delete, if it seems like it's going a little long, delete the last sentence and see where the sentence before ends it. Try ending it a sentence or two before what you think the ending is. Again, short, sharp, sweet, or nasty. How's everybody doing? Hi, ask me anything, and I mean anything. I am an open book. I'm happy to share any knowledge that I have. So Tina, I'm going to let you moderate.
Yeah, I was going to say, feel free to put questions in the chat. If you'd rather ask, just raise your hand. I'll start with the question. Libby, do you ever start with your ending? Do you ever come to your stories?
No, I don't think I've ever known who the criminal was
Mhm.
at the end of the story, or when I start a story. I always just start with that opening scene of Martin and his client.
I'm always
And
fascinated by people who tell me they don't know who the perpetrator is, especially novel.
no, I've told this story a million times, but I love telling it. When I wrote The Big Rewind, I got 3/4 of the way through and thought, I guess I should figure out who killed this girl.
And you
Like
rewind.
that was an exact thought. I was like, I guess I better figure that out because I have no idea. I've just been writing a little story about mixtapes, and
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
so Betsy, any craft books you recommend? As far as craft books, I really liked Bird by Bird. It's been a while since I've actually read a craft book. I have a bunch of them on my shelves. I have one on writing mysteries, but I can't think of what it is. So Betsy, if you email me, and I'm going to put my email in the chat in case people think of questions afterwards, I will give you the name of it because I can picture it on my shelf, but I can't tell you the name of it.
There's also the MWA puts out very irregularly, like every 10 years or so, their How to Write a Mystery.
Yes.
And that's really nice because it's broken out by setting and plotting and red herrings, and it's written by all the wonderful, all those great names. So that's a useful tool for that particular.
Yes.
Larry,
asked,
I was going to say, Larry asked, how much time do you spend in character development?
Not a ton, because for me, I let the characters develop themselves on the page. Martin arrived in a lot of ways fully formed. But I'm working on a novel now where I keep changing the characters, so maybe that's not the best way going about it. But in a short story, I tend to let them sort of tell me who they're going to be. And so that's a real like fly by night. And that actually goes to Victor's question, do I outline or reverse outline my stories? I try. I've got a huge, again, for the novel, I certainly don't do it for short stories, but for the novel, I mean, these are all my cards and they're useless. I might as well just make confetti out of them because I keep coming up with new things. I wish I was one of those people who outlined. I truly do. My friend, I have a friend who's a romance writer, and he outlines obsessively and sticks to them. I'm like, you're a magical human being. And it just does not work for me. Erin, which short story should I read next? I've got one in the Coachella review that is up right now if you haven't read it. It's called The Laws Which Govern Chaos. That's which one you should read next, because it's available.
Betsy asks about writing twists. Any suggestions, any tips?
Write the first twist that comes to mind and then tear it up and throw it in the garbage. And then you'll start thinking of the less obvious ones. Or actually, Betsy, honestly, write an outline with a really good twist and then get to it and completely change your mind and write something else. Which is what I do with my twists. But it really is, for me at least, twists are a trial and error sort of practice. I try to reverse motives. So what might have seemed like a perfectly normal motive now has something sinister and something curdled to it. Or in a story I'm working on now, what looked like this suicide among these friends, which really threw them all off. You start to realize, like, oh, wait a second, she got that Xanax from somewhere. And that's weird that this character needs a refill on hers. So it's a very understated twist, but then the reader goes, oh, what? No. So, and that plays to your character's motives and what they want. So figure out what your character wants and what they'll do together.
Jackie has a question regarding submissions, and I'd like to tie my question into her question. I was going to ask if for submission calls, are there favored word counts? Like, is there a sweet spot? And her question is, a little more general, what's the best way for new short story writers to approach magazines and other publishers?
I'm a big fan of just a short cover letter, like please accept my, or please consider my 6,221 word story, this story title here, for publication in Ellery Queen. And then a little bit about yourself. I graduated with an MFA, or I didn't. I write for a newspaper. I have taken several short story workshops with blah, blah, blah. Feel free to list me. Or I read Libby Cudmore's All Shook Down and really enjoyed it. You know, please consider my submission. Let them know that you've read the magazine, that that way they sort of know that you're in the guidelines. Really, don't be afraid. Don't lie. Don't say you publish stories that you haven't. If it's your first story, you can say that. Writers or magazines like discovering new writers, especially there's a section Ellery Queen, Department of First Stories. It's just the first story published in their magazine. So be bold, go submit. But always please read the guidelines. Do not submit without reading the guidelines. Oh my God. And ideally read some stories in the magazine. I didn't get up the courage to submit to Ellery Queen until I read a couple stories and I was like, I can do this. This is actually what I'm writing. So because some magazines, especially in mystery, some go more hard-boiled and some go a lot more gentle. There are stories that I would submit to Tough or Rock in a Hard Place that I wouldn't submit to Ellery Queen and vice versa. And now as for the sweet spot, I find that they tend to be either 2,000, 4,000, or 6,000. They're very rarely like 2,000 to 6,000. So really, and try to keep it under the word count. Yeah. If you're brushing right up against it, they may hesitate. But either 2, 4, or 6 should keep you fairly.
So when you say 2, 4, or 6, if somebody says that 6,000 is their 7,500 is their word count, under 7,500, but you write a 2,000 word, you're saying it's still a sweet spot because it's a good arc for a story, even though it's a the call is for up to. Yeah.
Honestly, places want to publish shorter because they can get more in an issue. Yeah. Yeah. I think shorter than the calls anyway, and I'm curious, it's worked for me, but still, I'm curious because I've never been the acquiring or, so there's not a favorite spot, but they're leaning towards shorter now. So that's good to know. Yeah. I remember I had a rejection from Ellery Queen, and I asked if I could rework it and send it back. And Janet said, yes, but keep it short. We're running really lean. So I ended up, the original that I sent her was somewhere around 6,000. The one I sent her afterwards was around 4. Oh. So, and again, I tend to write really, really, really tight. So that works for me. I wish I could write longer because they pay per word. So really, really wish I have another question about titles while we're on the subject. Do you find, is there any special magic to titles? Do you think it matters when you make submissions? Like when I write flash fiction, I kind of use titles as a way to help get part of my story across since I have a tight word count. So I feel titles are particularly important in flash fiction. But do you have anything to contribute to that? In flash fiction, very much so. With I stumble on titles. Martin Wade's stories, I tend to go with a song title because he's a former musician. So All Shook Down is The Replacements. I have one called Beyond Belief, which is Elvis Costello. I've got one called Negative Girl, which is Steely Dan. But sometimes I come up with a random title that I end up writing a story around. The second Martin Wade story A Brief History of Local Warfare came from a conversation I had with the friend that actually is somewhat the model for him. We were talking about bookstores, and that title just sort of came to mind because he was talking about history books. And I ended up writing the story. The first scene is just that image of Martin talking with this bookstore owner from whom a rare book has been stolen.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea where the story was going. All I knew was that the title, A Brief History of Local Warfare,
It was gonna work.
was, again, the vibe. Yep. I know that sounds really corny and TikTok, but short stories are a vibe. They're a whole vibe. Actually, Rob, what short story writers do you suggest reading from to learn as well as be entertained? I hear Libby Cudmore is really great. She's very entertaining, very smart. No, actually, for all of you, Rob Smith, great short story writer. But honestly, be reading the short fiction that is coming out now in your genre. So be reading Ellery Queen, be reading any literary magazines if you're writing more to that. Really, you can read what's come before, but the best way to be inspired is read what's coming out now. And there are so many literary magazines out there right now. A lot of them are online. We're starting to see a rise again in horror short fiction. But grab whatever stories you can. And that's where Twitter really comes in handy. And, we were talking earlier about the Maven's Facebook page and everything, but Twitter is so great for writers because people will retweet their short stories. You just click and it's right there. You can add so many of them. Mm-hmm. You can add magazines. But just, Rob, I don't have to tell you this, be reading what other people are writing right now in the present. And just keep reading that and read outside your genre. Obviously I tend to stay in mystery fiction, but I get on these, I think it's because I have an MFA. I'm like, I'm going to read a whole bunch of literary fiction that I don't understand. And I'll go and read this like very bizarre and funky. I'm rereading James Tad Aycock's, I can't even think of the name. It's like a map of the body of human knowledge or something like that. His prose is beautiful. Don't always understand what's going on, but his prose is so stunning. And I have to give a shout out to Barrel House, is publishing some of the most fun, most original writing out there. And I'm not just saying that because I'm going to their camp next week. But some of the work that's coming out from Dave Housley and Becky Barnard and Mike Ingram is really stunning work. So Barrel House. It's a long way saying that.
Any more questions out there?
Oh my goodness.
Can I ask one more?
Of course.
I know we're basically run out of time, but I have one more question. Prompts, how do you feel about them? And do you feel that you write better to prompts or just organically?
I tend to write organically. I wish I wrote better to prompts. I have an amazing prompt from Writer's Digest that I cut out and have not used. And I think with prompts, I feel like I'm going to get it wrong. I'm a very nervous, very kind of moderately obsessive compulsive writer. And I get very anxious about like, what if I do it wrong? So I don't use prompts. I wish I did. I should maybe get better in the habit. I leave myself prompts sometimes. Especially like in the novel I'm working on right now, I'll leave myself a little card, like that's what you're gonna write in the morning. So think about it. You got 12 hours.
What do you think makes a good prompt for a short story?
A sense of dread.
Mm-hmm.
So a sense of tension built in.
Thank you, Libby. I'm sorry, Rob, by the way, I missed your question in the chat. I went right over it. I got the one.
I'm not going to miss Rob.
Thank you.
Rob and I go way back.
Do we have any more questions? I know this was a terrific talk, Libby.
Oh, thank you.
You gave us so much to think about. And, many of us have attended lots of short story workshops, but of course, you have your own approach and it was really wonderful. I really appreciate it. I have a lot to think about. I've been meaning to get back to my short story writing, so now I will.
Yes, good. Yeah, I'm off to a retreat next week, and that's my focus is short stories, because if I look at this novel for one more second, I'm going to strangle the life out of it.
We understand.
Yes, you do.
Libby, thank you so much. Thank you to
Thank
all
you
of you.
so much, guys. Thanks for coming out. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks. You know, I
Make
see
a
some
note
of you that so many of you that I know.
Libby put her her website in the chat there. And
My email, my website's under construction right now.
okay, her email. Yeah.
I'm gonna
Libby.Cudmore@gmail.
Please email me. If you want to read any of the Martin Wade stories that you haven't, email me and I'll send them right along.
Perfect.